Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I apologize for my lack of upload last week. I ended up having 2 veterinary exams last week, so I wanted to dedicate all of my time to that, as studying for school comes first, along with animal care itself. So if I don't ever post, no, it's just because I'm probably doing stuff with school or I happen to get backed up with stuff. But I'm super happy to be back again today, and I'm really passionate about the topic that we're going to talk about today. So hopefully you guys can learn a couple things. And if you do happen to disagree with me, I would love to hear your responses in the comments below, so that way we can all continue to learn together. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about what makes a good beginner reptile, or should any reptile be classified as good for beginners? This topic is a little bit controversial sometimes, as a lot of people have a lot of varying views on what would make a reptile good for a first-time owner. For me personally, I'll state my opinion right off the bat. I do not think that most reptiles should be labeled as just beginner friendly. I think it does a lot more damage than it does good, and we're going to go into some of the reasons why that would be. But why do people say that a reptile would be good for beginners? The number one reason that a reptile would be said to be good for beginners is normally because the care is seen as less intense or less vigorous, or because the care is more studied. So there's care guides out there for the species completely, everything from diet to heating to lighting. It's all been figured out, so it does make it relatively easy to understand what the species requires, which would mean somebody new to reptiles would have a better time being able to read through a guide and replicate that at home. So right off the bat, you might be wondering, if all of those things are there, that sounds like a great way to set someone up for success. Why would you say that no species really should be classified as beginner friendly? Personally, I think that this tends to lead to a lot of issues with the certain species that we label as beginner friendly. Let's go through a couple just for examples. For lizards, it's often leopard geckos, bearded dragons, or crested geckos. For snakes, it's ball pythons, corn snakes, king snakes, and maybe a small boa like a rosy boa. For turtles, it's box turtles and Russian tortoises, and maybe a map turtle would be some of those that I would think right off the top of my head would be considered beginner friendly. So why would we say that that would not be something that we would want to classify these species as being just beginner friendly? One thing that I've found really common, especially within the reptile industry and in the pet industry as a whole, is when you label something as beginner friendly, they do tend to kind of fall on the wayside and see as not as fun or not as interesting, and therefore experienced keepers or keepers who do want to help push that animal's care even further to move away from this easy to keep and easy to house, they move it away from trying to push and expand on that animal's husbandry. The number one animal that I can think of for this would be the leopard gecko. Leopard geckos are often seen as just lizards that can go in 20-gallon longs with paper towel, get their mealworms only, or maybe the occasional cricket, do really well with handling, which also makes them good beginners, and that's it. And then some sort of like LED light. As we progress further in our knowledge on these animals from where they originate and how they do best to thrive in captivity, we have found that they do really benefit from really enriching enclosures. One thing that still is controversial is if you should offer them loose substrate, but from what I've found, as husbandry has increased and we've gotten things more dialed in, they do really benefit from those more complex enclosures. But the problem is with this species, they're just viewed as, oh, they're just the beginner reptile, they're just the thing that you get into to get you into reptiles, so people don't tend to super push past that beginner entry level care for those types of animals. It's not everyone. I have 2 leopard geckos and I feel like I've absolutely spoiled them with larger cages and enrichment and decor and all things like that. But it does tend to be the kid-friendly new beginner pet with the standard, like I said, 20-gallon long paper towel or carpet, not much enrichment, maybe 2 hides, and not much to do. One thing that I find as both a pro and a con for these typical beginner species is that yes, they do have full written care guides about them, but oftentimes those care guides don't reflect the same with each other, and they can vary incredibly differently based on the source that you're getting them from. As with anything, with any animal, doing your full research is super important, but if you do happen to go to a pet store or something because you want to get your child or yourself a reptile, you might just pull their care guide off the shelf, and there is discrepancies on which care guide is best, who wrote one the best, what's best for this. So it can become confusing for someone who just wants a beginner pet with all this different misleading information out there. Also, as our knowledge on these animals are changing, sometimes these care guides don't actively reflect the new things that are happening within the industry. So I don't think it's fair to say that just because an animal is common in the pet store and has many guides written about them, that they do have the same easy care standards that we typically think of with this species. Additionally, I think that some of the beginner pets are not as easy as people think that they are. My number one thought for this would be the bearded dragon. While they're super friendly, often love to hang out with their owners, eat super interesting diets, I think that they have a lot more complex social behaviors, housing needs, other care requirements that for a brand new owner can be incredibly difficult to mimic and get right in captivity. So then the animals tend to suffer because they followed the care guide, which said, oh, 40 gallon tank is perfectly fine, when we're seeing now that these animals require much more space, which makes them much more complex of a reptile species to own. Going off of that with caging, I often think that once an animal is labeled as beginner, it tends to make people not want to fully tell these new owners that, hey, they do require a bigger cage, because then they become less beginner friendly. Personally, I think bearded dragons need all the way up to 80 gallon tanks, 120 gallon tanks, which sounds like a lot. The tank on the bottom behind me isn't 120 gallon, it's a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot. It's for my corn snake Emmett. But I really do think that these bigger lizards, like the bearded dragon, do require the bigger space, but because they're often labeled as beginner friendly, most people are not willing to educate those brand new owners at the pet store, or because they're buying a tiny baby, they don't find it relevant to mention, hey, that animal's gonna need a really big cage once they're fully grown. I feel like a common pushback to the idea that shops or places won't tell people the full care requirements for these beginner species would be that the new owner should just already do their research and know what they want prior to going in and purchasing a typical beginner reptile. While I completely agree, and I think that that would actually be my full main point of this whole video, is that you should do your research regardless of whatever species that you do want. I think that that's actually the way that the reptile industry should go. I've heard a lot of people talking to new owners, especially at reptile expos, when they say, oh, I really want this species, I really love them, I really am interested in them, and these sellers will steer them away from that species because they're too hard, they're too complex, they're too difficult. You should try blank instead. Then that new owner will go and purchase that animal, and I can see on their face that while they're excited to have a brand new pet, they are deeply saddened because they did have their heart set on another species. I personally think that you don't necessarily need to have X number of years of experience in order to purchase this type of species or this type of species. I will completely agree that there are some species who have requirements that are definitely more dialed in, and they are less hardy when it comes to those requirements changing. For example, green tree pythons would be a really one right off the top of my head. Why I would say that is they require very specific temperatures and very specific humidities, where if it's not met, they tend to get respiratory infections a lot quicker than, for example, a king snake or a corn snake would. Or even a ball python if we want to stay in the same family. My issue comes in with those people who try to steer them away to something more beginner because they think that it would help them just be a better reptile owner. While I do think that we do want to be educating anyone purchasing a reptile so that they do have the correct information, I don't necessarily think that we should steer them away from a species if they do have their heart set on it. I think the best thing that we can do is try to provide reliable resources on that specific species in order to help them achieve the best care possible for the species that they actually want. What I find ends up happening is if they do get steered toward a beginner-friendly reptile, they will purchase it, and of course they will love that animal, but I think in the back of their mind they'll always be regretting that they didn't get the species that they wanted. Or if in the future they did get the species, and hopefully they are more experienced, they will find that they like that species that they purchased so much more and may tend to neglect or just look down on the beginner species that they got at the start because it wasn't what they originally wanted. I think that it is a little bit of a gatekeeping to say, oh, you can't work with this or you shouldn't work with this until you've had X number of experience or hours or whatever. Somebody could own reptiles their entire lives, even all the beginner species, and if they're not taking care of them correctly, yes, they're getting experience with reptiles, but they're not caring for them correctly anyways. So I don't necessarily think that time equals valuable experience. I think it is totally valid if someone is to ask you, hey, I am looking to get into reptiles, what are species that you recommend? And you're more than welcome or encouraged to put the beginner species on the list. They are there for a reason. They're often friendly, handleable, care is very easy to explain and easy to walk that owner through. The products are readily available. There's enclosures that are built for them that are easy to obtain. That's why they are, people do tend to migrate towards the leopard geckos, bearded dragons, corn snake, ball pythons, what have you. But I don't think that we should necessarily completely block off this or this or this because they're too advanced. The last thing that I will say, which is again controversial, and I'm more than welcome to read and hear all about your opinions, I really want to know what you think about these things, is that I really think that we need to start also stepping away from, you can't work with this species unless you're an expert. You can't breed this species unless you're an expert. You can't do blank unless you're some expert. With that said, I know there are wild caught and they're coming in and they're dying. Dragon snakes would be like number one on my list that I'm thinking. Yes, we do need people who do have the ability to deworm their animals, set up proper enclosures, monitor health, know the subtle signs. But I don't think it's fair to just say to somebody, you're not good enough, so you can't join us in what we're trying to do. Because let me tell you what that does. It takes somebody who has a passion for a species and wants to work with a species, maybe it is dragon snakes, I don't know, and you're pushing them out. So we could have had somebody who might have been the breakthrough person for that species, and now they're discouraged because everyone tells them, you're just going to kill it, it's just going to die, you're just going to put it in an alcohol jar, this, that, and everything else. Let me just also reinstate, the way an animal looks, so pattern or the texture of their scales, should not dictate you just wanting that animal. It oftentimes does, but I do think that sometimes can lead to an animal not being given the correct amount of care because it just looks cool. So I just want it. I just want to have it. These animals are not handbags, okay? You're not collecting them. You should be caring for them. Two different C words, collecting and caring. But people will see like a dragon snake, they look so cool, I just want it because it looks so cool, it's so cute. No. You need to do research, you need to care about the species, where they're coming from, what impacts them, and try to better that species. Try to better your care, better care in captivity for them. Because that's the only way we grow, especially with the species that are not being captively bred or only wild caught, or wild caught seems to be the most common that we're seeing. We need people who are willing to step forward and say, I have a vested interest in the species, not I have an invested interest in this individual that looks really cool. So that's my caveat for that. But I really do believe that if we just keep blocking people out and saying, you need to do the beginner reptiles first, you need to have this much experience. You need to, whatever. Nobody's going to fit that bill because we all do things differently and we all have our own ways of doing things. And if your animals are thriving in captivity and doing really well, or you have a really big passion for it and you've done all of your research, you know exactly what the cage requirements are, humidity, temperature, lighting, feed, how often you're feeding, do you need to vary the diet, how do you feed your feeders, where are you going to resource your feeders, what are you going to do if you lose your job and the animal has an issue, do you have a backup for vet bills? Like, there are things to think of about owning any animal. I just don't want someone to necessarily be like, I really want a rainbow boa really, really bad. I have a passion for them. I looked up everything about them. I know exactly what kind of cage and I'm getting ready to get the cage. And then they go to an expo or they go on an online forum and someone says, you just shouldn't get one. You just shouldn't get one because you're not ready or you haven't dealt with rosy boas, for example. Rosy boas are amazing. I have 2. I love them. But like when somebody really wants a beautifully iridescent, arboreal, active rainbow boa, they might not want the desert, arid, smaller rosy boa. You see what I mean? I just think it puts these animals in little boxes and we need to stop doing that. Okay, so those are just a few of my thoughts on what makes a good beginner reptile and why should we still be considering reptiles as beginner pets. My overall thought is no, I don't think so. I think that we need to instead be encouraging people to the newcomers to the reptile industry and just overall new owners, that instead they need to do quality research. Because you can do quantity research and I hope that would hit you with some good stuff, but we really need to be expressing quality research. So people getting out there, learning about the care requirements of all of the species, not just the beginner ones or the base level ones, so we can be bettering our husbandry for all the different species. Now, for you guys, if you happen to keep a species that is uncommon in captivity or you found differences in the way that you're caring for them, I encourage you to share those opinions and share those views because we need more people talking about it. I've found often that when somebody talks about something different for a species, I will go back to green trees again. I've seen a lot of people trying to do naturalistic and bioactive tanks, and a lot of the people that are been in the industry for a while will say, oh no, you can't do that. Oh no, you can't do that. I think care requirements should always be, we should always be striving to improve the way that we care for these animals. So if you found something that works for your leopard gecko, Uromastyx, garter snake, dragon snake, Russian tortoise, red-eared slider, whatever, pick your species. You need to be sharing those so that we can all continue to grow and continue to learn. With that said, I hope that this video was helpful or you learned something. I hope it's a rather quick video and I apologize for that. Getting into the swing of vet school, I have to focus more on my studies and make sure that I'm striving forward in my vet career. But I'm really happy to be bringing some more reptile content to you guys and be able to help educate on some different aspects of animal care. I really had fun doing the day gecko video, the last one. I thought it was super fun, so I can't wait. I'll do one for leopard geckos, the crested geckos, chihuahuas, my water skinks, so that way you guys can get to know all these different species and talk about the things that I do with my animals, as they might differ from what you do with yours. With that said, I hope you have an excellent rest of your week, and I will see you in the next one.